You get exactly what you asked for, and something in you starts looking for the exit before you've even had time to enjoy it. The relationship that's finally stable, the role you worked years for, the version of your life you used to fantasize about from the outside. And right when it settles into place, some quiet, persistent part of you starts picking at the seams, and you don't fully understand why, until you stop calling it bad luck and start calling it what it actually is. Self-sabotage is one of the most misdiagnosed patterns in modern life because it gets treated as a discipline problem, a motivation problem, something to be fixed with better habits or more willpower. Carl Jung would have found that explanation almost comically shallow. He didn't see sabotage as a failure of discipline at all. He saw it as a message sent from a part of the psyche that has good reason to distrust the very thing you consciously say you want, and that reason, however irrational it looks from the outside, is almost never irrational from where it's actually standing. To understand this, you have to understand something Jung insisted on that most modern psychology has quietly abandoned: the idea that the psyche is not one unified voice giving one unified set of instructions. It is closer to a household with multiple residents, each with their own priorities, their own history, their own fears, not always in agreement with one another, and often working at direct cross-purposes without any of them fully realizing it. The conscious mind, the part of you that sets goals and makes plans and says out loud what it wants, is only one resident in that household. It does not automatically have the authority it assumes it has, and when another, older resident disagrees strongly enough with the plan, sabotage is often the only language available to register that disagreement. This reframes the entire problem. Self-sabotage is not a random glitch or a character flaw. It is closer to a veto cast by a part of you that was formed earlier, under different conditions, and that has never been formally consulted about whether the current goal is actually safe. And it is very often not being irrational. It is applying an old rule to a new situation. The way a smoke detector installed after one house fire will keep going off at the smell of toast for years afterward, technically malfunctioning, but not without a reason rooted in real experience. Consider what happens when someone who grew up in a household where visibility brought punishment, where a parent's attention, once captured, tended to turn critical or unpredictable, eventually finds themselves on the edge of real, public success. The conscious mind wants this. It has worked for this. But an earlier part of the psyche, formed at an age when visibility genuinely was dangerous, still carries the old rule, and that rule does not update automatically just because circumstances have changed. It fires anyway, the way any deeply learned survival response fires, regardless of whether the original threat is still present. The result looks, from the outside, like inexplicable self-destruction right at the threshold of success. From the inside, examined honestly, it is simply an old form of protection doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting a version of you that, in this particular case, no longer needs protecting. Jung would have pointed to the concept of the complex here, a cluster of emotionally charged material organized around a particular theme, often formed early, that behaves almost like a semi-autonomous personality within the larger psyche. A complex built around unworthiness, for instance, doesn't just sit quietly waiting to be proven wrong by evidence. It actively filters incoming experience to confirm itself, and when reality offers something that directly contradicts it, real success, real love, real stability, the complex doesn't simply update its beliefs the way a rational argument would. It often responds by trying to eliminate the contradiction instead, generating the exact behavior that will restore the old, familiar equilibrium the complex has always operated within. This explains something that otherwise seems bizarre, why the sabotage so often arrives specifically at the point of success rather than at the point of failure. Failure doesn't threaten the old complex. Failure confirms it, which is uncomfortable but at least psychologically consistent. Success threatens it directly, because success is evidence that the old rule might have been wrong all along, and an old rule under threat does not go quietly, it escalates. It looks for any available lever, a missed deadline that seems unlike you, a fight picked with the one person supporting you most, a sudden and uncharacteristic carelessness right when consistency would have paid off. Anything that can pull the situation back toward the familiar shape, the complex, has always known how to survive inside. There is a particular version of this worth naming directly, because it explains a pattern many people notice in themselves, but rarely trace back far enough. It is the specific tendency to destroy relationships right around the point they become genuinely secure. Not the relationships that were unstable from the start. Those often end for straightforward, external reasons. It is the ones that were actually working, where someone showed up consistently, where trust had genuinely been earned, that trigger the strongest unconscious alarm. For someone whose complex around abandonment was formed by early inconsistency, a caregiver who was warm sometimes and absent others, consistency itself can register at the level of the complex as suspicious, even threatening, because the complex has no template for love that doesn't eventually withdraw. It has learned to prepare for the withdrawal by causing it early, on its own terms, rather than waiting to be blindsided by it later on someone else's. This is one of the more painful mechanisms to accept, because it means the very thing you have wanted most, real security, can feel, to an unintegrated part of yourself, like standing somewhere unfamiliar and exposed, with none of the old warning signs it knows how to read. Instability, paradoxically, can feel safer than security to a complex that was built entirely around navigating instability, simply because instability is the terrain it actually knows how to survive. There is a related pattern worth naming separately, because it operates through a slightly different mechanism and gets missed even by people who have already recognized the abandonment version of this story. It is the sabotage that shows up not around relationships but around financial or professional stability, someone who can build momentum toward security with real skill, and who then, at almost the exact point that security would become durable enough to rely on, makes a decision that resets everything back to zero. A stable job left abruptly for unclear reasons, right as it was becoming genuinely secure. Savings spent suddenly right as they crossed a threshold that would have represented real safety for the first time. This version of the pattern often traces back to an early environment where resources were unpredictable, where money, once available, tended to disappear again through circumstances outside anyone's control, teaching a young nervous system that stability itself is simply the quiet phase before the next collapse, and that collapsing it yourself, on your own timeline, is at least less disorienting than waiting for a collapse you can't predict or control. Jung's answer to this was never simply willpower, forcing the conscious mind to override the sabotage through sheer determination. He considered that approach both exhausting and ultimately ineffective, because it treats the complex as an enemy to be defeated rather than an outdated protector that deserves to be understood before it can be persuaded to stand down. Willpower can suppress a specific instance of sabotage. It rarely resolves the underlying complex, which will simply find a new avenue of expression the next time conscious vigilance relaxes, usually at the worst possible moment, precisely because vigilance cannot be maintained indefinitely without enormous cost. What Jung proposed instead was closer to negotiation than combat, a process of bringing the complex into conscious awareness, clearly enough to actually examine what it's protecting against, and then addressing that fear directly, on its own terms, rather than simply overriding it. This starts with something deceptively simple, catching the sabotage in progress and asking, honestly, what would happen if this actually worked? Not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine inquiry, sat with long enough to let an actual answer surface, because the answer is very often more specific and more revealing than expected. If this relationship stayed secure, then what? If this success stayed real, then what? The fear underneath sabotage is rarely as vague as simple failure. It usually has a shape, being seen too closely and found wanting, becoming responsible for something too large to sustain, losing an identity built entirely around struggle and therefore no longer knowing who you are without it. That last possibility deserves particular attention because it is more common than people expect and rarely discussed directly. For someone who has spent years identifying as the person who works hard against the odds, the underdog, the one who overcomes, actual sustained success can produce a genuine identity crisis, not because success is unwanted, but because an entire self-concept was built around the struggle rather than around any particular destination. Remove the struggle, and there's a real, disorienting question underneath the relief. Who exactly am I now, if not the person fighting for this? Sabotage, in these cases, can function almost like a return to a known identity, uncomfortable, but at least recognizable, rather than the harder task of building a new sense of self around having actually arrived somewhere. There's a version of this worth naming that runs in the opposite direction, and it complicates the simple story of sabotage as pure self-protection. Some people don't sabotage the goal itself so much as sabotage their own enjoyment of it once it arrives, achieving something real, and then finding themselves oddly unable to feel the satisfaction they expected, immediately scanning for the next target instead of allowing the current one to register as complete. This is a subtler form of the same underlying mechanism, a complex that was never built around avoiding success, but around avoiding the vulnerability of rest, of arrival, of a moment with nothing left to prove. For someone whose early worth was tied entirely to achievement, achievement without a further goal attached to it can feel strangely unsafe, as though stopping to actually feel the win would somehow forfeit the right to keep being valued at all. Jung's larger framework offers a useful way to think about what these complexes are actually doing, even when their methods look self-defeating. He believed the psyche has a natural compensatory function, meaning that when consciousness becomes too one-sided, too fixated on a single goal, without regard for the parts of the self being neglected along the way, the unconscious tends to generate a counterbalancing force, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through mood, and sometimes, less comfortably, through behavior that seems to directly contradict the conscious goal. This doesn't mean every act of sabotage is secretly wise. Many are simply outdated fear masquerading as protection. But some sabotage, examined honestly, turns out to be pointing at something conscious ambition has been steamrolling past, a value quietly abandoned in pursuit of the goal, a relationship neglected in favor of a career, a piece of the self left behind entirely in the rush toward an achievement that, once reached, doesn't actually address what was missing. Learning to tell these two categories apart, outdated fear versus legitimate compensation, is some of the more advanced and necessary work in this entire process. Because treating legitimate compensation as mere sabotage to be overridden simply repeats the same one-sidedness that produced the imbalance in the first place. There's a practical dimension worth naming here, because abstract understanding alone rarely interrupts a pattern this deeply grooved. The moment right before sabotage tends to have a recognizable physical signature, a specific kind of restlessness, an urge to create distance or conflict that arrives faster than any conscious reasoning can catch up to. Learning to notice that specific sensation and pausing inside it rather than immediately acting on it is often the single most effective intervention available. Not because the pause resolves the underlying complex on its own, but because it creates the smallest possible gap in which a different choice actually becomes available, rather than the old response simply executing on autopilot the way it always has. It can help, in this pause, to ask a slightly different question than the obvious one. Rather than asking, "What am I afraid of?" which can feel abstract and hard to answer under pressure, it is often more productive to ask, "What would have to be true about me for this fear to make complete sense?" and then check whether that thing is actually still true now. A person about to sabotage a stable relationship might discover, under that question, an old belief that they are fundamentally too much for anyone to stay with long-term. Checking that belief against the actual, current evidence, the specific person who has, in fact, stayed, consistently, for a meaningful length of time, often does more to interrupt the sabotage in the moment than any amount of general self-soothing. Jung also believed that dreams frequently surface this material long before it becomes consciously legible, particularly around periods of impending success or stability. A recurring dream about losing something, about being exposed, about a structure collapsing, arriving specifically during a period when life is objectively going well, is often the complex attempting to communicate its anxiety through the one channel still available to it, while the conscious mind is otherwise occupied, congratulating itself on how well things are going. Paying attention to this material, rather than dismissing it as unrelated noise, can offer an early warning considerably before the sabotaging behavior itself becomes visible in waking life. There is also a social layer to this worth naming honestly, because sabotage rarely occurs in a vacuum, and sometimes the people around a person are, consciously or not, participating in maintaining the very pattern they claim to want resolved. A family that has always related to a particular member as the struggling one, the unstable one, the one who needs help. They may respond to that person's genuine stability with a subtle discomfort they can't quite name, discomfort that gets expressed as skepticism, as unsolicited concern, as a kind of prodding that seems designed, whether intentionally or not, to test whether the change is real. This external pressure can reinforce an already present internal complex considerably, making the work of staying stable not just an internal negotiation, but also, at times, a quiet negotiation with people who had, without realizing it, come to rely on your instability as a familiar and stabilizing feature of their own picture of the world. None of this excuses behavior that genuinely harms other people in the process. Understanding the mechanism behind sabotage is not the same as being absolved of responsibility for its consequences, and the people affected by a partner's repeated self-destruction, a business's repeated near misses at stability, deserve more than an explanation after the fact. But understanding the mechanism does change the nature of the work required. From a battle of willpower you're doomed to eventually lose through simple fatigue, to a slower, more honest negotiation with a part of yourself that has been trying, however clumsily, to keep you safe, using information that stopped being current a long time ago. There is a specific kind of relief that tends to arrive once this reframe actually lands. Not the relief of having solved the problem permanently, that rarely happens all at once, but the relief of no longer needing to interpret every instance of sabotage as evidence of some fundamental brokenness. A pattern with a comprehensible cause is something you can work with. A mysterious, recurring self-betrayal with no discernible logic is something that simply generates shame every time it happens again. And shame, reliably, makes every one of these patterns worse rather than better, because shame is simply more threat, which is exactly the kind of signal the old complex was built to respond to by escalating its defenses rather than standing down. What actually helps is closer to what Jung described as befriending the complex rather than defeating it, approaching the part of you that keeps reaching for the exit with genuine curiosity instead of contempt, asking what it's actually afraid of, and then, deliberately, offering it evidence, again and again, that this specific situation is not the one it was originally built to survive. This is unglamorous work. It rarely produces a dramatic before and after moment people can point to. It produces, instead, a gradual lengthening of the gap between the old alarm and the automatic reaction to it, until, eventually, staying becomes slightly easier than leaving, and building becomes slightly more familiar than destroying, not because the fear has vanished entirely, but because it has finally been given enough current information to loosen its grip, just slightly, one repeated experience at a time. It is worth being honest, too, about how uneven this process tends to be in practice. Progress in this kind of work rarely moves in a straight line. A person can go months without the old pattern surfacing, long enough to believe it has genuinely resolved, and then find it reactivating in full force during a period of unrelated stress, exhaustion, or unfamiliar territory, when the conscious resources normally available to interrupt it are simply depleted. This is not evidence of failure, or of having wasted the earlier progress. Complexes, particularly old and deeply reinforced ones, tend to have more resilience than a single sustained period of stability can fully account for. And the more accurate expectation is not a single clean resolution, but a long, gradually improving relationship with a pattern that may never disappear completely, only loosen its grip further each time it's met with understanding instead of shame. There is a final piece of this worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire project in a way that Jung himself considered central to his work. The goal was never a self with no complexes at all, a permanently smooth, frictionless psyche immune to old fear. That version of psychological health does not exist and was never, in Jung's view, actually desirable even in theory, because it would mean discarding the very material, however uncomfortable, that gives a life its particular depth and specificity. The goal was a self in conscious relationship with its own complexes, aware of them, capable of naming them accurately when they surface, and increasingly able to choose a different response, even while the old alarm is still ringing somewhere underneath. That is a considerably more modest and considerably more achievable goal than the total transformation most self-improvement narratives promise. And it is, in the end, the only version of this work that actually holds up under the ordinary pressure of an actual life. Somewhere right now, someone is standing at the exact edge of something they've wanted for years, watching an old, urgent restlessness rise up inside them with no clear cause they can point to, mistaking it for boredom or doubt or evidence that this thing was never actually right for them after all. It may take them years to recognize that restlessness for what it actually is, an old protector, still guarding a door that no longer needs guarding, doing the only job it has ever known how to do.